Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Fireside Chat. Today is April 26th, and we will be talking about magnitude economics. The Fireside Chat is a get together of Gridcoin community members held every Thursday on the Gridcoin Discord server at 8 p.m. Eastern, midnight UTC. And if you want anything spoken about, feel free to pitch in and we will do the best we can to cover any subject related to Gridcoin, blockchain, cryptocurrency, decentralized education, leadership, technology, or analysis. And it is hosted by myself, Jay Ringo. We've got Goblin Popper, who we let back inside this week. Hey, Goblin.
Thank you for letting me back in.
And over in the corner, we got Chocolate holding it down.
Hi.
Before we jump into the main discussion here, we've got a couple news topics to cover. They're mostly about BOINC projects. The best news we've heard this week comes from World Community Grid, which is IBM's umbrella project that runs a bunch of smaller tasks under the larger name World Community Grid. And they are starting up 3 new climate change projects out of 3 universities. Let me see if I can pull them up really. They are coming out of Emory University, Far Eastern University, and the Delft University of Technology. And they're just going to be covering there's 3 separate projects running different data analysis on the impacts of climate change. I think one of them has to do with aerosol effects, and there's I can't think of the others off the top of my head, but I will try to put a link in the comments below. So take a look, and they will be going in the next couple of weeks, I think. And it's a pretty cool way they set this up. They put a call out for new projects to run from WCG, and they got, I think it's 70 submissions, and they went through and vetted all the projects with their own scientists and through some third-party entities to make sure they would fit with WCG and their mission. And the projects agreed to make all their data open data. So it's a pretty cool step forward. Just randomly adding 3 new projects to a very large project already. And then the other BOINC project news comes from TN Grid, which is having some server issues. And they are working to solve them as fast as they can, but there is no estimated time on when that project will be back up and running. So if you are running it, either keep running and wait for it to come back, or maybe switch over to another project so you can keep your magnitude steady, which ties in nicely to exactly what we're talking about today with magnitude economics. So does anyone want to explain what magnitude is? Or I can, if no one else wants to.
Yeah, I think Barton did.
Well, magnitude is how Gridcoin measures team contribution to BOINC projects in a way that's not entirely reliant on the BOINC credit system, which is not the same across various projects.
Exactly. So it's and the way it works is Gridcoin has a pool or a kitty of magnitude that it distributes to approved projects, to whitelisted projects. And then you get magnitude based on your contribution to a project relative to the other contributors to that project. And if you're running multiple projects, the magnitude is separate for each project and then added together to create your total magnitude, which then determines how many Gridcoin you receive from the daily Gridcoin mint, which is about 28,000 Gridcoin a day right now. And the total magnitude Giddy is about 115, not about, I think it's exactly 115,000 magnitude distributed evenly across all BOINC projects. And that creates what we call magnitude economics, which incentivizes people to do specific things. Primarily, it helps smaller projects receive some more computation power.
Can we make sure we mention also the equation that's used? Not necessarily like to focus on it, because talking math equations out loud in a podcast is not necessarily the best to listen to. But just at least to make sure it's out that there is equation and what it factors help influence the growth of a magnitude of magnitude as you're crunching.
We can try and pull that up. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Are you talking about how like magnitude is distributed, Goblin?
Yeah, so like if my Raspberry Pi, right, is crunching something, right, I have like 3 magnitude or something right now. So what are the variables that are used to calculate my magnitude? Right?
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that that's established as we start to talk further into it, so that there are some basics that, you know, people can listen for, like, okay,
Yeah.
is rack involved, is time involved, so on and so forth.
Yeah, let's
Can
have
you-
Jim talk about this.
Can you guys hear me? I'll start it out. You guys can start adding into it. I may get cut off because the plane's about to leave. But let's start out by talking about the 115,000. Essentially, the first step is that the 115,000 is basically split into the number of whitelisted projects. So I don't know how many are there right now? 24, 25?
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, something like that. So the bottom line is you're going to evenly ration the 115,000 magnitude equally to the whitelisted projects. So the first step in this is to take the 115,000 and divide it by the number of active projects. That's the magnitude that's going to be issued for each project. And from that, you essentially, for each project, the number of people that are participating that actually have beacons, you're gonna add up all of the rack for the people that have valid beacons on that project. You can think of that as like the denominator, and the numerator is your rack, as long as you got a beacon. And basically, the numerator, your numerator over the denominator, which is the project's rack for that project, that ratio times the magnitude allocation per project gives you your magnitude. So, you know, that immediately tells you that you're really in competition with everybody else that is crunching on that project for that particular project's allocation of magnitude. And that's one of the things that's, you know, about this that I think Ringo pointed out. You know, projects that have a smaller amount of participation, the way the economics work is it sort of drives people towards participating in those projects. Because at least while there's low participation, you know, for a given amount of compute power, you're going to get a higher magnitude than on a project where there may be 6,000 different people participating. I don't know. Hopefully that's a good start at it. You guys could start adding into it.
Absolutely. That's a perfect way to put it. You're competing, that your rack over the total rack for that project means that you're competing only with other people on that project. And because every project has the same magnitude to distribute, it makes it even as perfect. And that does a couple of things. So Goblin, you said you're running a Pi, and some projects work better with Pis or with CPUs, and other projects work better with GPUs. So if we just took everyone's rack to all the whitelisted projects, someone running a Pi would be competing directly, or someone running a Pi on a Pi-specific project would be competing directly with someone running a high-end GPU on a GPU-specific project, and the person running the Pi would get a very low magnitude because they're not doing as much work technical work as someone running the GPU. They might be doing more work on that project because it's built for the Pi. But this distribution of magnitude does is make it so that those projects that are Pi or CPU specific compete among each other, or the participants on that project compete among each other instead of competing against GPUs and CPUs, or high-end GPUs, which is a very, I think, a pretty cool thing that Gridcoin does, in that when you think of proof of work, if you don't have the top end hardware or the newest ASIC miner, you're really out of the mining game. You can't earn Bitcoin, for example, without just continuing to buy new GPUs to compete against other people who continuously buy new GPUs. And at the same time, it makes it so if there are only 10 people crunching a project, they are splitting the same amount as magnitude as 100 people crunching a different project. So the 10 people are going to receive a little more Gridcoin than the 100 people, which means that people who are looking around at the different whitelisted projects, looking to get the most GRC out of the work they put in, will likely see that there's a project with a fewer number of people splitting the same amount of magnitude as the project they're currently working on with a lot of people, and they'll move to the smaller project to give them a little more processing power, and it helps distribute processing a little evenly. And this also causes some problems that I'm sure we'll get into later. But does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, and I just also want to clarify. So I also looked up the equation just so visually I can also see it. It exists a lot of different places, and you can obviously just Google it for anyone who is listening and visually has trouble representing the conversation. And so the first aspect obviously is your rack, so your recent average computation, right? That's what it stands for. Your recent amount of work over your teams. So when it says team, what is it? When it says team, is that everyone on that project, or is that like when I think team, yes. I think team like GRC pool, which is probably incorrect.
It's everyone on that team on that project.
No, again. So when you say team, are you saying everyone who's currently processing for that project, regardless, or are you saying in a subset in a team that you can do BOINC teams?
No. So basically, it's if you're part of Team Gridcoin, it's your recently acquired credit, recent average credit over the recent average credit of every other Gridcoin member who is crunching that same project. So if you are contributing to 10% of a project's computation, you get 10% of the Gridcoin allocated to that project. And every project is allocated the same amount of Gridcoin.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I got the allocation part. I just want to make sure the team aspect that I've been reading in terms of like a team rack, like how team is defined. So okay.
Right, because you have to be on the Gridcoin team currently. We're hopefully going to look to remove this requirement in the future, but you have to be on the Gridcoin team to receive Gridcoin at this time.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
and you have to have a beacon to be part of the total too. So unbeaconed folks are not going to be included in that rack summation for the project.
Well, and unless you're on like a pool, like a GRC pool where they have the beacon for you.
That's right.
So,
they have essentially a wallet that holds the beacon for everybody. Right. I think that's the way it works for everybody in the pool.
Yep. So
Gotcha.
There's also one more thing that MAG does, which Barton mentioned briefly, which is it has to do with the way that BOINC rewards credits. So BOINC is a fairly decentralized platform. BOINC is just a platform. It's not really an entity. It's an infrastructure, Berkeley open infrastructure for network computing. So the people who build projects on BOINC choose how they distribute credits. So some projects distribute tons of credits for a work unit completed, and other projects distribute a smaller number of credits for a work unit completed. So just like the CPU versus GPU crunching, if you are working on a project that distributes a small number of credits, you want to get rewarded based on other people who are crunching the same project and receiving the same proportion of credits based on how much work they're doing for that project. And you don't want to be competing against a project or someone working on a project who's receiving 1 million credits for a work unit if you're only getting 10 credits for a work unit. So it helps deal with that decentralization issue of BOINC. which has been developed for a long time. Boink has gone through several iterations of how to distribute credits, and this is just how they do it now.
We should also mention that each individual project decides how they distribute credits. And so, you can run your Raspberry Pi on one project for a day and receive 100 credits, and run it on another project for a day and receive 1,000 credits. So the distribution of credits is completely arbitrary, which makes it very difficult to compare contributions from one project to contributions to another project.
Exactly.
Which also brings up some other points. Jay Ringo, did you want to cover anything else? You also mentioned some problems. I felt like maybe that was like
let's pull off from the problems just like because there are plenty. But we will get into them, I guess, now, unless anyone, I just wanted to make sure everyone understood the basics of magnitude distribution and the reasons that magnitude exists, and we don't just use credits for GRC distribution. So does anyone have any questions regarding just those aspects of magnitude?
I'm not sure if this quite falls into that category, but I know there was a lot of chatter about removing the team requirement. I honestly don't understand the significance of that.
Go ahead, Chuck.
I was going to say, people joined teams, regional teams, country teams, because they just to encourage some competition, some friendly competition, some tribalism a bit. And there's a lot of people who have been part of teams of, from their country for a really long time, and they don't really want to leave. And they want to receive Gridcoin, but in order to receive Gridcoin, they have to leave this team that they've been a part of for a long time. And that when you've been a part of something for a long time, you don't really want to leave it. And so it kind of, and when you compare that to the question of, why do I have to leave the team? That I'm a part of, there isn't really a good reason. There isn't a good enough reason to make someone leave, team, SETI USA or something. So that's the problem. If we remove the team requirement, there's a good chance we would bring in a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And you can tie it directly to Bitcoin. So one of the main reasons Bitcoin took off is Satoshi used this thing called gamification, and they made it so people competed with each other to participate to create blocks. And gamification is an amazing tool that's recently had a lot of study put into it, but we've known about it as sort of a society, especially a internet gaming society, for a long time, like guilds and clans, and people just like to join teams of their friends, smaller communities that work together on a bigger project to sort of have friendly competition between one another. So Bitcoin did that in 2008, 2009. Boink very intentionally did this when they built their platform out of SETI in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001, 2002. And they said people are more likely to participate in this open source volunteer distributed computing platform if they are able to play with their friends and compete for awards and get little medals and have friendly competitions that give you a little sense of pride. It's a little fun. It's more fun. So there's not this technical reason for someone to stay on a team, but there's a psychological reason. People enjoy doing it, and we're starting to put games, take the idea of gamification and put it into many other aspects of our society, and Boink is no exception, neither is all of cryptocurrency. All of cryptocurrency is structured like a game.
I think the easiest way to kind of explain it is, well, I have one point, but then the easiest way I think to describe it is kind of like, most people on here will use like Reddit or Imgur or Steam it, right? And where you have fake internet points, right? Got to get those fake internet points. And my friends and I always make those comments of like, like you make a post, like you send it to your friends to get like a couple extra fake internet points. And when you're posting something, like you actually have a question, it'll probably only get 2 upvotes. You'll probably post it on some random other account. But when you're posting something legitimate, you always make sure you're logged into your real account, right? And for no real other reason than just people like seeing that they've done something good. They like the gratification, right? It's that dopamine receptor kind of conversation that people always talk about when you get the like on Facebook.
Exactly.
And so it's a little stupid, little tiny reward for really just doing something, and it's nothing but like a little counter on a screen, and it's kind of cool, right? But my point being, my other statement, right, is I didn't know this, and I'm not sure of this. So you're telling me that Boink doesn't allow you to join multiple teams? People can't join like Team Gridcoin or whatever, and they can't join Team America, right? They can't. They can only join one.
Each project lets you join one team. So
Gotcha.
you can have different teams on each project, but one team per project.
And most people, if they're like, oh, I process only World Community Grid or something, then they're going to want to stick with the original. Yeah, okay. So it's not, okay, that makes a little bit more sense that you can join 2 teams, but they have to be on different projects. But yeah, I think that would be my compromise in this situation. I don't know how technically difficult it would be to implement, but would just be to still enforce the team idea, but to just duplicate the rewards by giving to both teams that you're part of. There's no reason to not, right? Like, well, no, I mean, if it's fake, if it's fake points that have no real other it doesn't have a compensational value, right? I mean, I guess if you're talking about multiple cryptocurrencies, but I don't know.
I agree with you on that, but Chocolate, you go first.
Yeah, I was going to say the reason we can't do that is because that would require a change to Boink, not a change to Gridcoin.
Yeah, I'm talking about Boink making that change. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I mean, joined right up this time. Okay.
For a variety of reasons, I mean, in general, we it seems, I mean, I'm also comparatively new here, but it seems like we want to avoid making changes to Boink as much as possible. We kind of want to be, out of the way. And so making that change, it might see as infringing upon their territory. They might not take too kindly.
All right. So if you are listening to this podcast to the recording, we had a couple technical difficulties with Craig, the recording bear. He abandoned us during a conversation about team requirements. So the last thing that you hear is Chocolate talking about making sure that we're not pushing anything on Boink. We will be talking about team requirements in probably a full episode at a later date. So don't feel bad you missed a pretty long conversation. But to quickly respond to that, as long as we're both open source communities, Boink and Gridcoin. So as long as we're working to help Boink and not just ourselves, we can work to help ourselves and Boink. But as long as it's very clear that what we're doing will benefit Boink primarily, that's the main reason we're doing something, I'm sure they would be more than happy to have this giant community with a lot of very brilliant people with really great ideas and the ability to code the ideas. I'm sure they would love that help. So it's just a matter of doing it in that way and making sure we're helping them and not ourselves. So we will keep an eye out for a future episode on the team requirement and why we have it and why we might want to remove it in the future and the technical difficulties with removing it. But for now, we're going to go right back into magnitude economics. And before we got into team requirements, Chocolate was about to bring up a couple issues that the current mag scheme of even distribution between projects could bring up. Chocolate, do you remember what you were going to say?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it for months. So I think the biggest issue with the current magnitude distribution is that it creates a really perverse incentive structure where you can want to crunch a particular project, say World Community Grid, but you have an incentive to crunch another project, a financial incentive to crunch another project. And so if Gridcoin is to reward people for contributing their idle processing power, it seems to me that a better way to structure the incentives would be to have it so that people are rewarded for crunching the projects that they like the most, rather than the projects which have the least amount of computing power on them. And this was touched on earlier, but just to explain really quickly, basically the less computing power that's on a project, the more you can get by switching to it, everything else staying the same. Assuming everyone else stays on the projects that they're currently crunching on and don't change anything, you can get a financial benefit by switching to a project that's crunched less. And you can get the most Gridcoin by going to the project that is crunched the least. This, I think, is a really bad incentive structure because, if you truly believe in the mission of, World Community Grid, or you truly believe in the mission of, the climate change projects that are going to be coming online soon, or if you truly believe in the mission of, a SETI at home and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, it seems wrong to have people receive less for crunching projects that have more users crunching them. So some of the most crunched projects are, SETI at home, World Community Grid, Milky Way at home. You will receive less for these than you will for other projects. I think this is really, really detrimental to the to Gridcoin as a whole. I think it really, really holds us back. Barton, you can say something, because I can go on for this for a long time.
Before we can I lay down a little foundation real quick?
Go ahead.
Yeah. What you're describing is a scenario, a reality in which most people do this work for profit. And the people who built BOINC are no stranger to this sort of volunteer distributed computing. They've done studies, and you mentioned earlier that BOINC hasn't developed in a while. And you're right, there's a long lull, but there is recent development on it. There's a project that was called TBD. It is now called Science United. I will try to remember to put the link in the YouTube channel because it's hard to Google, but they are starting to develop it, and they do studies on what would make a person participate in a distributed computing project. And for the most part, people want to crunch things that they think are cool. They want to work for science. They want to work for like astronomy. They want to work for cancer. They want to work for protein folding. They want to do these subjects with complete disregard for the money involved. So in the current Gridcoin ecosystem, or in the current Gridcoin community, you might be right. But once we scale to a large number of just everyday individuals, most people will still continue to BOINC what they think is cool, and the number of profit hoppers will probably be a pretty significant minority, which does not is not meant to negate what you're saying, because I think what you're saying has a very valid background to it. But just as a foundation, as we go into this conversation, understand that a lot of people will continue to work for WCG regardless of how much money they're making off of it.
So I agree with that, but I don't agree with everything you said. So I actually think that the more people that come in my guess would be that it would probably be the same proportion that we currently have in terms of people who want to make profit and people who want to crunch what they want to crunch. And by the way, you those aren't mutually exclusive. You can want to make money and
absolutely
and want to make the world a better place. But in any case, supposing everything that you said was completely true, I still think it doesn't make sense for someone to receive less Gridcoin for crunching a project that they believe in. or more than another one.
Okay. Snip,
so-
you wanna
Go ahead.
Can I also add to that?
all right, Goblin then.
Yeah. I don't consider myself a profit hopper, but what I would describe myself as is someone who searches for like the net zero, right? I'm not trying to make money. I'm just trying to crunch projects that overall match my electrical output, right? Like I'm pretty much just trying to I'm trying to spend as little money as I can crunching while still also contributing. That's why I, do all those other things to get electricity. And so what one thing I will add though, right, regarding Chocolate's point is I think it's important to also say that as things get added and taken away, right, like projects get added and taken away, if if it doesn't matter what project you're on to get money, right, to get GRC, and it doesn't matter, right, then I feel like as though newer projects come in, there's no immediate incentive for people on the larger projects to flow to the smaller projects. And so I totally agree with you in the fact that I should be allowed to process for cancer and not feel like I'm earning less or getting less like money towards my electricity back. Like that shouldn't be allowed, or that doesn't make sense. But at the same time, I think that giving an incentive to assist the smaller projects, or at least flowing to the equilibrium of an equal amount of processing on all projects, with the exception that people also want to continue processing on whatever ones they want, is kind of also a little bit more mindset, my mindset in that, which again you don't necessarily have to agree with, but that's just kind of how I see it. Is that it helps to offer that incentive to push towards that equilibrium.
So I actually
Hold on, Chocolate, before you respond to that, let's hear what Snip has to say, and then we're going to bring up how Nick's just said in the chat, and then we'll respond to all of it together. Just because there's a lot of people who want to say a lot about this stuff.
Yeah, so I am a graduate student, soon to get a PhD, and I jumped into Gridcoin mostly because I see it as a tool that I very well may be using sometime in the future, sometime in the next 10 years or so.
Awesome.
Because there are many projects that could really benefit from distributed scientific computing that BOINC makes possible. And I'm very attentively watching this develop. So I'm going to disagree with Chocolate and say that it should be more up to the voting on whitelisted projects as to who wants to do what for Gridcoin, and people should be monetarily encouraged to crunch projects that might not get as much attention for being, as we say in academia, sexy. So if my project on say how do electrons flow through a device while I'm looking at it in an electron microscope, right? If that doesn't immediately look as exciting as, say, searching for aliens with SETI, then the common person probably won't crunch it, even though it may be a very important scientific endeavor. I think that close look at these projects should occur for the whitelisting, and once those projects are whitelisted, unless people decide we should graylist this or take it off the whitelist, they should be encouraged to crunch all of the projects, not just the attractive ones, because otherwise we're just going to have people that want to look for aliens, and that's really about it. If we look at how the distribution of work is for BOINC overall.
Okay, and that ties, Chocolate, sorry, it's going to go how Nick's, and then I have a very short response to that as well. How Nick says in the chat, I see the current system as project researcher-centric and flop-based reward system as cruncher-centric. Is Gridcoin about rewarding crunchers evenly or about encouraging participation in every project which is worthwhile enough to be whitelisted? Which is very similar to what Snip was just saying. It seems like he's arguing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the whitelist should be the process that determines that this project is worth giving a portion of the magnitude pool to it. And then beyond that, it should be fairly evenly distributed. But please do correct me if I'm wrong.
That's almost exactly what I'm saying. Yes.
Okay, yeah, and Hownick says Snips and him are on the same page. And to add to both of your arguments, as we grow, I think it's important to consider commercialized projects and as they come in. And I've used this example before. A project that is good at marketing, who spends a lot of money on marketing, will be able to convince people to crunch their project more than a not sexy project, as Snip put it. So a project that tries to find a cure for balding is going to be able to convince people to work on his project because there's a lot of money in that industry, versus a project that is trying to figure out how, I don't know, how to turn an electron into a proton, which it's not possible, but you get the idea. Like, so people will go for that sexy project of, ooh, cure for balding, lots of money in it. When you incorporate the project or the rain feature into that, maybe that marketing project will be able to further incentivize people to crunch their project, which will take processing power away from those less sexy projects. And now, Chocolate, go.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to respond to.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. Yeah, that's why I wanted to do it one at a time, but I'll try my best. So I'll go in order.
We can go over the time limit today, by the way, because this is a really awesome subject.
Yeah. So okay. So Snip Atomic. I also work in academia. I also do research. Not in the same position as you, but still.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
all right.
Goblin,
Get out of here, Janeway.
Did you say something important?
Wow. Apparently not. No, I just my point was just on my take on yours. It wasn't necessarily an argument against. It was more or less a reflection as to my stance, the other side of the argument. So not necessarily something you have to respond to. So.
Okay. So going to Snip Atomic's point. For sure. So let me just point out a few other things. So one, so my most preferred solution to what I introduced as what I consider a problem is to measure the flops that people contribute and then normalize to that, meaning that if you run a Raspberry Pi on one project for a day, you'll get the same as if you run a Raspberry Pi on any other CPU project for a day. And there's a lot of complicated stuff within that, I'm aware. But I'll set that to the side for a moment because that's a whole nother rabbit hole. So the first thing is that does not stop us from creating an incentive structure for people who want or from designing an incentive structure for smaller projects. So, for example, Snip Atomic. So I've wrote like a very long, detailed post about how we can compare CPU and GPU computations. Hold on one second. So that's like the third time I posted that here.
I'm going to try and put that in the YouTube link as well, because that is a great read. I would recommend everyone checks it out.
So basically, I completely agree with Goblin Popper. I completely agree with Hownix. I completely agree with Snip Atomic. I agree with all of you that it is important and it is necessary to incentivize crunching smaller projects. I'm not convinced that the current magnitude distribution is the way to do that. So let me bring up a few other counter arguments. So, one, let's take something like Collat's conjecture, which has been around for a really long time. Collat's conjecture is not a new project. it's also granted it's not a sexy project, but it has support. And so the question is, if a new project comes along and people really do truly prefer that new project to Collat's conjecture, isn't Collat's conjecture then taking away potential computing power from that new project that you want to bring along? So that's one perspective, one way to look at it. Another thing is, I've also thought, I mean, this would be years in the future, but I've also thought about bringing a Boink project to Gridcoin, like massive Monte Carlo simulations, and then using, machine learning to sift through the data. It would be really, really tough. And it's kind of nerve-wracking to kind of approach that new project or try to convince people to crunch that new project. Isn't there a way to, for example, or I think there will be a way in the future to be able to just join like a general whitelist project and kind of effectively spread your resources evenly across all projects. I don't think that's crazy. And a simple way to visualize that is just to say, okay, I have a Raspberry Pi. I'm going to join this one project, and this one project is going to send me work units from all these other projects. It's going to, take and find some common denominator, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I've, after a month, I've contributed evenly to all these projects. And that can be for people who do want to contribute to all of these projects. Another way to do it is, and somebody suggested this in I wrote another post about ranking projects and saying, giving, either multiplying factors or higher percentages of the Gridcoin reward pool to some projects over others. And somebody in the comments suggested, I think it was Hotbit actually, suggested, have some minimum amount of Gridcoin assigned to each project, and then after that, have everything, ranked. And the same argument could be made for a direct flop to GRC proposal. You could say, okay, we're going to take 25% of all the Gridcoin and we're going to split it across every single project, and then the other 75% is going to be spread proportional, based on computational contributions. Netflix. So Netflix says that's a reasonable compromise. I do think that is a reasonable compromise, especially since I do come from a position of I really do see when you contribute your laptop or your Raspberry Pi or your GPU, I see it. And Jay Ringo, thank you for mentioning this. I think in like my first serious post, see it as an expression of will. I am contributing. The project to which I contribute my computing power is an expression of my will. What do I want to see succeed? What do I want to see happen? What discoveries? What contributions do I want to see in the world? I do come from maybe. In most of those posts did come from a more radical perspective, from that kind of radical perspective. Yeah, Jaringo, go ahead.
Yeah, it's the expression of speech, like money. People argue that money is an expression of speech. Well, if money is an expression of speech, then your IPP is an expression of speech, and where you put it is what you're saying you support. And I like that on a philosophical level. And then I also want to support your perspective too, because I see it and I kind of agree with it at the same point. I'm very much on the fence on how we should do this, and I do like some of your proposed compromises. So you have projects like Collat's, and then you have projects like World Community Grid. I have 2 points as point one. So you have those two projects competing against each other. World Community Grid, funded by IBM, huge backing, and it also has it's an umbrella project. It has many smaller projects encompassed in it. They're about to add 3 more projects on climate change alone. So it is going to have more people crunching it, and it could get to the point where there's 100,000 people crunching WCG and 5,000 people crunching coalesce conjecture, and do we want that skew to exist? And that skew, that the monetary incentive skew would exist in the current structure. And then on top of that, I'm a huge advocate for scientists doing more to educate people, because I think that's one of the main problems we have from the scientific community right now, where they live in academia. It's not the worst way that some people say it is, but they live in universities, they live in their own bubbles sometimes, and they're not incentivized to teach other people. They're only incentivized to describe their project to 1 or 2 people in the grant system who will then give them money for it. But if they're incentivized through what you're describing, Chocolate, to educate people to their project and why it's useful, the general, the general, I'm trying not to use zeitgeist, but the zeitgeist will incorporate scientific language, and they'll be encouraged or incentivized to hire people who are good at communicating science communicators like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, people like this who spend their life teaching people about science. They'll be incentivized to bring more people like that in. That will increase the size of the scientific community at large, and they will. The better they are at convincing people that their project is worth researching, the more people will crunch it, and the more rewards will be distributed to people that crunch it. But at the same time, there are small projects like garage tinkerer projects that just don't have the ability to bring people in like that, and they should not be punished for being small, even because they're probably also doing really cool stuff.
Yeah, Jermingo, thank you, because that was actually my last point, which is that part of it has to be with education. We should encourage people to crunch smaller projects, but people also have to make the case for why their projects should be crunched at all. I don't think it should just be handed to them. I do think, and yeah, it does take a lot of effort to make a Gridcoin project. Absolutely. It's really difficult. Sorry, did I say Gridcoin? I meant Boink. I'm sorry. It takes a lot of effort. It can take a lot of time and a lot of money. Yeah. What was the point?
But to Snip's point, when you're trying to catch your footing, Snip's arguing that process is the whitelisting process. You have to convince the community that you should be whitelisted, and once you're whitelisted, that's it, and you don't need to continue convincing people to crunch your project. You get magnitude distributed to you evenly, based like your world community grid, no matter what you.
That's kind of true.
Yes, Snip. So I mean, yeah, I was talking for a while. Do you have some thoughts about what I was saying?
Yeah, a couple. I mean, to be clear, I fully understand and appreciate your position, Chocolate. I just wanted to present the other side of the argument. And there are some details here that should be understood and accounted for. The biggest one is if we have projects that are umbrella projects, right, that cover a bunch of smaller projects, they shouldn't be punished for being a bunch of smaller projects, where they would get an unfairly small distribution of Gridcoin compared to the other solo projects. So there is some balance that we need to find there if we want this distribution to be fair. One thing that I am somewhat concerned about that I expect we are going to get into in the next section here is that there isn't a good way of me if I just want to crunch for Gridcoin and say, put me on the projects that need me the most. There isn't a good way of doing that without doing a fair amount of calculation and figuring out other people that run my systems, my CPU and GPU, and doing a lot of trial and error over the course of quite a lot of time. I think that a project or a way of just saying, throw me at all of these things and distribute how my hardware is needed would be really, really nice.
I agree with you. I think that is a huge issue, and it's funny that you bring that up because that is exactly what Science United is for BOINC. I mean, I think we're going to need it for Gridcoin eventually, but what Science United is doing is saying you don't need to sign up for each project and figure out which space project you want to crunch. You just say from a drop-down menu, you want to crunch space projects. And then it is, from my understanding, it determines which space project needs the crunching power based on how many people are crunching each space project. And it throws you at the appropriate one based on that requirement. So that's sort of a way to do that without Gridcoin involved with it. But the way we distribute magnitude, as long as each science project is whitelisted, it will sort of throw people at the project that will give you the most Gridcoin for crunching a space project. But it would also be awesome to have that developed for Gridcoin specifically. And I agree with Goblin when who said it, that will come over time. Chocolate said that.
And I would actually love to have that as well, because like, for example, I mean, I'm using a Pi, right? So with mine, I left on vacation for like 5 days, and like day 3 or 4, I checked GRC pool, and I realized that there weren't any work units going to it for the last like week, and I just hadn't been paying attention. And it's like, if I was assigned more to like, you know, the project of like you know, Piable Science or something like that, right? It would allow me to sit there and be like, I just want things to be sent to me. I don't have to worry about that stuff. So that would be really cool. Additionally, Chocolate, I also agree with that, with your stance. I just want to make sure that we have, you know, we have an answer, right? Like something to put in place before we start saying, like we don't like what's currently there. Which your second comment kind of filled in, which is what should we do instead? There's a lot of other people talking in the chat that are coming up with various little proportions of compensation, which are all really cool. All of those are, I mean, I don't want to say they're feasible because I'm not on the dev team and I'm not going to throw that at them. Although I love giving Barton work. But the point is, like, all of those, I mean, if you could literally just graph out the scenario of like, okay, how many users would go on it, what would compensation look like, what would the GRC and magnitude distribution look like if we did do those compensation levels or those GRC spread out proportionally across those projects. If you had those kinds of like charts, or just like made one in Excel real quick and said, if we did it this way, this is how it would look. It would look almost similar to how we do it now, but the compensation and the encouragement for projects wouldn't change much, and the larger projects would also get a little bit more love for the massive amount of hardware you people have to use nowadays to actually even get something worthwhile, right? So I mean, I think there's a bunch of ways to move forward with it. I don't know if we currently have anything in the pipeline for modifying the magnitude, right? Barton, is there anything in the?
No.
No. Okay. I mean, it's a cool system how it works. It's not perfect. I think a lot of people have like little tiny things with it, but once you start to actually read through the dev notes and go on some of the Slack channels and read some of the math that they're doing and how they're trying to figure something out, and you go to the economics channel and you read some of it and look at some of the charts, you kind of say like, oh, I don't agree, and then you look at all the charts and you're like, well, I don't agree, but after looking at all that, I have no way of making it better, right? It's usually what ends up happening whenever I kind of have a comment or something on something, right? So anyway, that's a lot to say, but yeah, so I agree with you, Chocolate. But I'm not sure what the answer is the main point.
I wish Jim were here because he's a huge math guy, and huge shout out to him. He tried to come. He's on a flight right now. He tried to get in on the Wi-Fi. I guess it didn't work. But in terms of if it's possible, I'm Barton, please correct me, but I'm fairly confident that it's possible to say, like, for example, let's just say we have 100,000 magnitude, just for ease of math. We say 50,000 of that magnitude is evenly distributed among projects, all whitelisted projects, and then the other 50,000 is distributed based on the number of people or the number of flops contributed to that project. Is that possible, Barton?
I mean, yes, it would be possible. The difficulty in implementation and testing to ensure it works properly would be quite a large undertaking.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I expected, right? I mean, changing the math of how things are distributed isn't that hard, right? But making sure that it actually, that the blockchain accepts it and all that other fun things. I'm just gonna start saying tech words and buzzwords right now. Like all that stuff works. Yeah, just that's a lot more difficult, I think. So.
Yeah, the math is, may be easy, might not be. I mean, I don't think it's been investigated that thoroughly. And I mean, I guess that's kind of my, like, I feel like that, like, everyone's obviously welcome to work on it, but I personally feel like that's my months. I mean, not like, yeah, when I started writing these posts, I was like, oh, maybe like in a couple of years this will change. Like it's
Maybe when I'm 50, just whatever.
Well, no, I mean, like, realistically, I've been thinking about this a lot, and yeah, it's like really, really complicated, especially the flop measurements. And so I'm not in a rush at all. I don't think we're at a stage as a community right now where we have to be like, where this is the main focus, or this is something we have to get implemented right now. This isn't a wallet. This isn't a matter of wallet security, or forking or anything. I just think it's like a long-term incentive structure change. Something else I wanted to point out though was is that so Goblin, what you said is that like you want to break zero, you want to break even. So the reality is that the current magnitude distribution makes that more difficult for the vast majority of crunchers.
Yeah.
So for example, if we were to make a pure flop to GRC, if we Hownix, I definitely have a comment on that. Thank you for saying that. So a pure flop to GRC proposal, what would basically happen is that the vast majority of crunchers would get an increase in the GRC they're getting, and then a bunch of people who would get and then a bunch of people who crunch smaller projects would receive less.
Yes.
That's basically what would happen. It would make it less. It would really like be redistributed. I mean, in a sense, it's kind of redistributing it. I don't want to think about it that way.
Yes.
But like, that's effectively what would happen.
The worry I have though with that is my hardware is very small. So if to get the same level of compensation or similar, I'd have to move to a higher end project, or I'd have to hope that more people move to my project. And I'm running very low tier hardware, right? Like I'm running Raspberry Pis. These things aren't crunching very much, right? But in doing that, oh crap! I'm sorry. What was my point? Right. In doing that, right? I can't. My hardware doesn't really survive on the higher end stuff. So I'm kind of going to the highest level things I can. Thanks, Barton. I'm kind of going to the highest level projects I can, which is pretty low, right? I mean, my rack is only like 500, I think, after a few weeks, and that's like pretty much the max it's really going to hit with my Pi.
I'm not sure exactly what your point was there, but I wanted to address what Hownix said, which is that just so people pardon. What Hownix said. So for people who aren't who can't read what's in the chat, a tiered whitelist that gives different total magnitude to different projects might be easier to achieve and could get closer to a fairer reward system without figuring out flops. That was exactly the idea I had in mind. Okay, guys, I corrected myself. Okay. So Hownix, that was exactly what I had in mind when I wrote the proposal for the ranking projects post I had. Hold on, let me pull that up real quick.
Also, the one other thing I want to add is one of the ideas that I know I floated around with you, Chocolate, which was and I think this kind of was hinted at a little bit with what Snip said, and that's kind of like the microgrid of having a project where very small scientists can throw a lot of work units in, probably work units like 1,200, 1,300 work units.
Hold on. let's let Chocolate finish, and then let's go to microgrid as a full subject after.
No, well, I'm saying it's very, very related to what he was mentioning though. I'm not trying to bring up what I'm saying is if that was added, right, as a project, that would get a ton of magnitude or like associated to it because it's now whitelisted. And then it doesn't have a lot of work units in it, right? So like one really large cruncher could come in, probably consume about, realistically, maybe like a third of the units in it, and then it's out, and they have a lot of the magnitude, and no one competing against them at the moment because then all the work units are out, right? So I guess I worry about how that distribution would also affect small projects if they come in with small amounts of work units.
Okay, I'll respond to that in a second. But yeah, just getting back to how Nick's point. So yeah, that was that. The reality is that tiering projects, depending on the way it's done, could and would yield a much fairer GRC distribution. Especially in combination with total credit delta. It would be vastly easier to implement than the flop to GRC proposal. And I'm completely aware of that. That's why I posted that. Even though I prefer the flop to GRC proposal, that's why I did the research into that. And there could be other ways for ranking projects. You know, my list was unexhaustive. I only had 3 suggestions. But yeah, so Hanuk, so yeah, I completely agree with you. Like a total credit delta plus the ranking Gridcoin project would yield a much fairer distribution, absolutely. The other thing I also wanted to point out about the whitelisting and blah, blah, blah is that, remember, this isn't a 100% democratic. Maybe if we did, even the magnitude distribution as it is, I mean, that's something I haven't brought up in earlier podcasts, I don't think. But basically, the current magnitude distribution means that if you can have 2 or 3 times more voting power per magnitude by crunching one project than another, which that really seems inherently undemocratic to me.
That's a good point.
Yeah, so like and there's no, I mean, you can make the argument, okay, someone should be rewarded for crunching smaller projects, but I don't think someone should have more power in voting for the same piece of hardware.
Let's save that conversation for a future podcast on the voting system, but that is a very good point.
Yeah. So that being done, what was the next? Oh, right, the microgrid thing. Yeah. Regarding the microgrid proposal, so actually I wrote that in one of my, I'm not going to link to a third article because that's just getting too narcissistic, but one of the, like, I think the first article I wrote actually mentioned about including smaller projects, and the only way to include smaller projects is to Emma and Maddie, yes, thank you. The only way to include smaller projects is to measure the flops, as I understand it. I think that's the only fair way to do it. I can't really think of any other way unless we want to, someone wants to buy Gridcoin and then rain it on the people who crunch it. That's that's another way, but like that's no longer that requires an input of like money on the part of the people who want that project crunched. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that.
Before we go too deep into microgrid, because I think we should talk about the idea behind microgrid in this episode right now. But I also think since this is going to be an extended episode, we should take a bio break in a little bit. But before that, your first comment about tiered systems, because we've been talking about that for a little bit. I think that is a potential. I have, when I hear it, my immediate reaction, my gut reaction is to have reservations towards that sort of thing. But I was trying to find the GitHub thread, but someone made a very good point about a tiered system regarding when Gridcoin becomes larger and there are potentially more commercial entities looking to use our giant supercomputing network, because we are top 20 most powerful supercomputer in the world, or like what, 22, 23. So they proposed, if I'm remembering correctly, a tiered system that says, look, if you are a commercialized entity, you have a data set that has a beginning and an end. You're tiered separately from a project like SETI or Colats, which has no end. I guess SETI, I guess they both have an end, but technically. And they're rewarded differently based on the level of the project. Does that make sense?
So J Ringo, quickly about Colats. Theoretically, it might never end. In fact, it's very likely that it will not ever end, because the Collatz conjecture does seem to be correct. I actually, in one of my earlier posts, I was considering ranting about how much I thought Collatz was a waste of time, but I felt like people would hate me, so I didn't bother.
Yeah,
but
they would.
I like how you still. I love when people do that. By the way, when people are like, I didn't want to say how much I hate Buffalo, but I didn't want to say it. But
he said it in a sentence and not a rant.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't state it. You just inserted the fact that you wanted to state it in a sentence. Exactly. Thank you.
Snip, what are your thoughts on the tiered system? You said it sounds amazing and necessary regarding commercialized projects versus like garage projects.
Yeah. So if I were to submit one of my computational jobs to the BOINC network, I don't think that I would be able to supply enough work units to keep on going for years and years. Perhaps I would have enough that it would go for 6 months or something and really use quite a lot of computational power. But at some point, projects get finished and you publish them, and they need to have an end. And for these smaller things, it would be amazing to have a project that, an umbrella project per se, that would accept submissions of this sort.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, that ties in with microgrid.
Yeah, and
so
I will say
let's.
Yeah, no, Jay Ringo, I know you're going to shut it down. That's why I'm going to loop it back into the actual conversation.
I'm not. I want to go in depth on it, but I got it.
Yeah. So,
let's take it.
But I will say my concept on that, right, and we'll talk more about that, and like Jay Ringo and Chocolate and my idea about it on that. But my at least idea regarding the magnitude, related to that small of a project, is that magnitude should probably be like calculated in terms of you can see what it is, but it shouldn't really be tied or related towards any actual distribution of GRC, right? And the main reason would be it would be extremely hard to calculate, and the source finder project pops into my head, right? I made a lot of GRC comparatively to what I normally make on source finder. Working on source finder for like several weeks, and I got a really big magnitude, and then it ran out of work units, so nobody was able to compete and get the magnitude or pull it away since I wasn't like working on it. And I sat with a massive magnitude for a month and got tons and tons of GRC, right? And I feel like that's the worry of magnitude, asserting that onto a small project, which is why I feel like the main reason that would only work is magnitude shouldn't really be tied towards those possible small projects, because it messes it up a lot, and it makes it so that people want to abuse it. Because I'll tell you, I love science. I love contributing to science. I would totally abuse the crud out of that. But hey, that's just me. I'll just be honest to everyone. I don't care.
Most people would. Yeah, that's humanity. So let's take 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and talk about microgrid, because that is directly connected to how we can maybe change the magnitude system, but also maintain a system that benefits smaller projects with limited work units without having them to get directly whitelisted and then have to run all this time. The source finder problem, essentially. All right, so we're back after a quick break, and we had a little chat, and we decided that microgrid is a an idea that is that warrants its own episode. So we are going to possibly do it next week. If not next week, then in a coming week soon, within a month probably. So keep an eye out for that. And just real quick, microgrid is an example of what we were talking about in the second episode of contributing without coding. It is the result of just a couple of us getting together and just talking about a bunch of ideas that would never get implemented. And eventually, just by talking over a series of days, we came across something that we thought was kind of pretty cool, and it has the potential to be implemented and could be useful for a lot of smaller projects like Snip was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to throw it over to Goblin to see if you some.
Yeah, it's kind of that Easter egg of our weekly podcast or fireside chat. That if you've been listening since like episode like 2, you've probably heard a lot about it. But something we haven't really sat down and fully vetted out or really explained, and something that an official paper hasn't been written about. But overall, the concept that I think was officially broken down significantly in like episode like 5 or 6, the concept is just to have a Boink project hosted by most likely someone in the GRC community that people like PhD students, college professors, small-time lab assistants, small-time researchers who have a lot of data requirements can use our Boink server to load up projects, to load up work units, and have those and be compensated via the raining function, which is a Python script that allows you to buy GRC and then let it rain over the people who are processing for you. So I mean, it's really in its infancy in our thought process, and obviously not really being worked on right now. But it offers a lot in terms of potentially driving up a lot of demand for GRC, because it would put a dollar value behind it, and it also gives a lot of small time people an access to a supercomputer for effectively pennies on the dollar, right? Because I've seen what hosting and all those things cost for small time developers, and it gets pretty heavy. So if anyone's hearing this and you want to join and talk about how it would be beneficial to you, feel free to join whenever we announce we're actually going to talk about it. We'd love to hear about if this would actually help you, or if you actually have work today that could be used for it. That would be kind of awesome to see if there's actually a real demand for it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's I think it's a great idea that I look forward to, even if it doesn't get built. I look forward to just exploring where it could go, because there are people like Snip who have data sets that they can't last for months on end, and they just need their data crunched, and there's a demand for it. So we can build it into our ecosystem. So I guess that's it for this episode. It was an amazing conversation about the magnitude economics that currently exists in Gridcoin and
Everything
the
else.
problems we see with it. Yeah, and everything else. The problems we see with it, potential solutions to these problems, and potential future paths we could take. And it's really only just the beginning of the conversation, because like we talked about earlier, this is changing the magnitude distribution or the magnitude economics. It's not something that's going to be done anytime soon. There are much higher priorities, among which are porting the neural net over to C++ so that Linux users can participate. And there are a couple stopgaps in place. So because that process is going to take a while. So there are a couple of minor developments that will help Linux users get the neural net sorted out. So keep an eye out for those developments coming up in the coming weeks or months. And we also talked a little bit about the team requirement, which is going to be a future episode as well, because that was a hot topic. So this will also probably be another episode in the future, but get involved in the conversation, because that is one of the most useful things you can do as a contributor to the community. Get your ideas out there, tell other people that you disagree, that you agree, that you think there's another way it could be built. And really join these chats. There's also the Hangouts on Saturdays, every other Saturday. The next one is in 2 days. If I get this uploaded in time, you will hear that before the chat. But they are all right here on the Gridcoin Discord server. So unless anyone has anything to say before we sign off, We will see you next Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, midnight UTC. Keep an eye out for a post on what the topic will be. Have a good weekend, everyone.